The moment Martin Okafor walked into the Rideau Valley Teachers Association spring banquet, 3 people stopped mid-sentence to look at him. Not because he was impressive, because he wasn't. He had arrived in a gray wool blazer that had seen better winters, carrying nothing but a quiet expression and a glass of water someone had handed him at the door. He didn't scan the room looking for anyone important. He didn't straighten his posture or check his reflection in the mirrored wall beside the coat check. He simply walked to a table near the window, sat down, and looked out at the Ottawa River below, which was still running cold and fast with the last of the spring melt. The Rideau Valley Teachers Association annual recognition banquet was held every April at the Chateau Frontenac Riverfront Event Center in Manotick, not the famous one in Quebec City, just a venue that borrowed the name and none of the grandeur. It was the kind of room that tried too hard. Crystal chandeliers that were slightly too bright. White tablecloths ironed to a stiffness that made them uncomfortable to touch. A podium at the front with the association's crest printed on a foam board that someone had forgotten to laminate properly. About 120 people filled the space. Principals, union reps, curriculum coordinators, department heads, a few retired administrators who came every year because it gave them somewhere to be. The kind of gathering where everyone knew who mattered and made sure to stand within conversation distance of those people. Martin knew no one at his table. He had been assigned seating as a guest, brought in by the district as a quiet acknowledgement of something he had apparently done, though he hadn't been told specifically what the evening was for. He'd received a letter in February from the Ottawa Carleton District School Board. You were invited to attend as a recognized contributor to secondary science education in the region. That was all. He had almost not come. He was 51 years old. He taught physics and earth sciences at a secondary school in Stittsville, and he had done so for 23 years without particular fanfare. He was not the kind of teacher who was written about in newsletters. He coached the robotics club on Thursday afternoons and marked papers at a folding table in his kitchen on Sunday mornings. He drove a 2009 Subaru Forester with a crack in the rear bumper and a tragically hip sticker on the back window that had started to peel at one corner. He lived alone in a bungalow on Fernbank Road. His daughter was studying marine biology at Dalhousie. They talked on the phone every Sunday at 7. He ordered sparkling water when the server came around. The man beside him, whose name tag said Gerald Strom, curriculum director, District 7, looked at the water, then at Martin's blazer, and quietly redirected his attention to the woman on his other side. That was fine. Martin didn't need Gerald Strom's attention. He watched the room instead, the way he watched a classroom before starting a lesson, not looking for anything in particular, just letting the full picture settle. That was when he saw her. She was standing at the far end of the room, near a tall window that looked out over the river, holding a glass of white wine she hadn't touched. Her name tag said Laura Ashby, Science Department Head, Carlington Secondary. She was perhaps 45, dark-haired, wearing a burgundy blazer that looked like it had been chosen carefully. She was smiling at a fixed point somewhere above the crowd, the kind of smile people use when they need their face to be doing something other than showing what they actually feel. No one was talking to her. That wasn't unusual in itself. Rooms like this one had natural clusters. People found their people and stayed there. But what Martin noticed was different. It wasn't that Laura was standing alone and no one had found her yet. It was that people were actively moving around her. A circle of department heads formed nearby looked in her direction and reorganized slightly so their backs were to her. 2 women from what appeared to be the elementary division started toward her, slowed, and then veered toward a different table without acknowledging her. A man Martin didn't recognize walked close enough to see her name tag, registered something in his expression, and kept walking. Martin watched this for about 4 minutes before he understood that it wasn't accidental. He looked down at the water in his glass. He turned the glass slowly. He thought about staying where he was. The table around him was beginning to fill. Gerald was now in an animated conversation about the new provincial curriculum framework. Someone was distributing bread rolls. A woman named Patricia was telling a story about a parent-teacher interview that had apparently gone terribly sideways in February, and the table was laughing in that specific way that meant they all had a version of the same story. Martin set down his glass, pushed back his chair, and stood up. Gerald Strome registered the movement without acknowledging it. Martin walked across the room. He didn't move quickly. He had the particular unhurried walk of someone who has decided on something and does not need to announce it. He passed 3 tables, skirted the edge of the dance floor, empty this early in the evening, and reached the tall window where Laura was standing. "Laura Ashby," he said. Not a question. He'd read the name tag from 10 meters away. She turned and the smile adjusted. Surprised, slightly wary, the kind that comes from having been left alone long enough to stop expecting company. "That's me," she said. "Martin Okafor." He nodded toward the window. The river's still running high. Usually it's settled by April. She looked at him for a moment, trying to locate him, to figure out what he wanted. He could see that. He didn't fill the silence for her. "It's the snowpack," she said after a moment. "Late melt this year. My kids did a watershed unit in February and we tracked it. What grade? 10s. It became something of an obsession. One of my students started sending me river gauge updates on the weekends. A small, genuine laugh, the first one he suspected that she'd produced all evening. I told her that was dedication. She said she just liked numbers. That's the best kind of student. It is, Laura said. The ones who forget they're supposed to find it boring. The shift was small but real. Her weight settled back slightly. The set of her shoulders changed. Martin did not ask her why she was standing alone. He did not ask why the room had arranged itself around her like water around a stone. He was not performing curiosity. He had simply walked over, said her name, and started talking about the river. After a few minutes, the server passed, and Laura finally took a sip of her wine. They stood there while the room moved around them, talking about the watershed, and about the new curriculum changes to the grade 11 science course, and about a documentary on deep-sea geological formations that Laura had used in her class, and that Martin had apparently assigned to his own students 2 years earlier through a different source. "Which edition?" she asked. "The one with the sonar mapping segment. Oh, that's the better one. My students were frustrated that it ended before the thermal vent sequence. Mine too. I told them that's how science works. You get 3/4 of an answer, and then you have to wait." She laughed again, this time without the effort behind it. Across the room, Martin noticed, and noted and set aside, that several people were watching. Not watching the way people watch something pleasant. Watching the way people watch something that confuses them or discomfits them. Gerald Strome had found a reason to reposition himself slightly. A woman near the podium had stopped her own conversation and was observing the window with an expression that Martin couldn't quite read from this distance. He didn't look away from Laura. "Are you a department head?" she asked. "No, I'm just a teacher." He said it the way he said most things, without apology, without qualification. "They sent me a letter in February, something about regional recognition. I mostly came because the parking is better down here than up by the school on a Wednesday night." She smiled. It reached her eyes this time. "Honest, efficient," he said. "There's a difference." They were still standing at the window when the association president, a man named Douglas Hewitt, came to the podium and called the room to order. People filed back to their tables. Martin looked at Laura. "You're at which table?" he asked. 14. She said it in a way that made it sound like a postal code for somewhere remote. 12, he said. "That's close enough to wave." She shook her head slightly, not dismissive, more like she was filing something away. They parted. Martin walked back to table 12 and sat down. Gerald was talking about collective agreement negotiations now. The bread rolls were cold. Someone had already eaten Martin's without noticing. He looked across the room toward table 14. Laura was seated. The 2 other women at her table had pulled their chairs slightly together, their conversation angled away from her. A man Martin recognized as a vice principal from one of the South End schools had looked at the seating card across from Laura and quietly swapped it with the one at the adjacent table. Martin watched this. He thought about Laura Ashby saying, "My kids did a watershed unit." He thought about a student sending river gauge readings on weekends. He thought about the specific kind of teacher who produces students like that, and what it takes to be that kind of teacher, and what it costs. The first award of the evening went to a principal from Canada for administrative leadership. Applause. The second went to a teacher from Barhaven for extracurricular contribution. More applause. Between awards, the room ate and moved around each other with the practiced ease of people who had attended many events like this and knew the choreography. Laura ate alone at her end of the table. She did it neatly and without visible distress, which Martin recognized as the particular composure of someone who has had practice. He picked up his water glass. He set it down. He listened to Gerald explain the difference between the old and new math curriculum frameworks, which was not a short explanation. He nodded at the appropriate moments. He thought about why a room full of educators, people who had chosen, as a profession, to give a damn about other people, would organize themselves so deliberately around one person's isolation. He had pieced it together from fragments. A name mentioned in passing. A quick exchange between two women near the coat check when he'd arrived, where he'd caught the words Carlington and situation and something that sounded like board complaint. He had a working theory. He wouldn't have bet money on it, but he had a sense. What he was more certain about was this: whatever the reason was, and whatever had actually happened, it was not written on her face. What was written on her face, when she forgot that a room was watching, was the expression of someone who was still showing up anyway. He found that worth something. The speeches continued. Someone from the Ministry of Education attended by video call and gave remarks that were politely received and immediately forgotten. A teacher named Renata gave a short address about land acknowledgement and stewardship that was the only part of the formal program that felt like it had been written by a human being. Around 8:15, the tables began to loosen. People refilled their wine glasses and migrated. The dance floor opened to a playlist that was calibrated to offend no one and therefore moved no one. The kind of music that existed in the background of events like this the way fluorescent lighting exists in hospitals. Martin watched Laura push back her chair and walk toward the bar at the side of the room. He watched the cluster of people near the bar shift, not dramatically, just enough. He watched her order something and stand there, glass in hand, facing the window again. He stood up. He walked to the bar, ordered another sparkling water, and stood beside her. "Still high," he said, looking at the river. She glanced at him sideways, and for the first time all evening, something in her expression relaxed completely. Not the managed composure, not the practiced smile, but something underneath both of those. "You don't have to keep coming over here," she said. "I know. People are going to assume things. People already assume things," Martin said. "That seems to be what they're doing tonight regardless." She was quiet for a moment. Below them, the river moved over its stones. "I put in a formal complaint last fall," she said, "against the previous superintendent. For what he did to a student. He was a friend of most of the people in this room." She looked at her glass. "He's retired now, gone to Kelowna, but I'm still here, and so is what I did." Martin didn't say anything for a moment. "Was the complaint valid?" he asked. "Yes, then you did the right thing." She made a small sound, not quite a laugh. "That's what they say about whistleblowers, right before they describe all the ways it complicates everything." "It does complicate things," Martin said. "I'm not going to tell you it doesn't." She looked at him. "I had a student 12 years ago," he said, "grade 12. Brilliant. Wanted to do astrophysics. Got caught plagiarizing on a major assignment. My department head at the time wanted to let it go. The student was going places, the optics." He paused. "I reported it through the proper channel. The student was suspended. Didn't get into her first choice of university. She took a gap year." Laura waited. "She emailed me 2 years ago," he said. "She's a postdoc at the University of Victoria. Geophysics. She said she needed to tell me that the year everything fell apart was the year she figured out who she actually was and what she actually wanted." He looked at the river. "That doesn't make it easier. I'm not saying it does. I'm saying it doesn't make it wrong." The silence between them was different now. It had weight, but it was the kind of weight you could set something on. "Martin Okafor," she said quietly, like she was testing whether the name she'd been given matched what was standing beside her. "Still me," he said. She shook her head. Not dismissive, not quite a laugh. "You came over because you watched a person standing alone and decided that was something worth addressing. The river helped," he said. "Good opening." This time she did laugh. A real one, unguarded, short, the kind that surprises the person who produces it. The room continued around them. Someone was doing an increasingly committed version of a two-step at the edge of the dance floor. The association president was working his way around tables, shaking hands with the practiced efficiency of a man who had decided tonight was good for optics. He reached the bar, looked at Martin, then at Laura, and arrived at some private calculation before smiling and moving on. Martin watched him go. "He's going to pretend that didn't happen," Laura said. "He's going to have to decide how long to pretend," Martin said. "That gets exhausting. You seem unconcerned. About which part?" She gestured vaguely at the room. Martin considered this. "I've been teaching for 23 years, he said. "In that time I have learned that the opinion of a room at its most comfortable is not reliable data." He picked up his water. "Rooms like this one are only comfortable when everyone agrees not to name the thing they're all thinking about. The moment someone declines to agree, the room reassigns them to the wall." He looked at her. "You didn't decline to agree. You did something harder. You named it formally on the record, with your name attached." Laura looked at him for a long moment. "Where were you assigned to sit?" she asked. "Table 12, and you keep leaving it." "Table 12 has Gerald Strom explaining the math curriculum and cold bread rolls," Martin said. "The trade-offs are acceptable." The playlist shifted. Someone had apparently been given access to the cue, and the tempo lifted. Something from the 90s that the room responded to by pretending they were too dignified to respond to it while their feet moved slightly. "I haven't danced at one of these in 3 years, Laura said. "Since before everything." Martin set down his water glass on the bar. "The floor's mostly empty," he said. "Easier to keep a reasonable distance from the math curriculum discussion over there." She looked at him. "That's the least romantic invitation to dance I've ever heard," she said. "I was aiming for accurate," he said. She was quiet for 2 seconds. Then she set her own glass down. The dance floor was not empty. There were perhaps 6 or 7 couples already there, but it felt open in the way a room feels open when you walk into it with a decision already made. They didn't waltz. They didn't do anything that required formal instruction. They moved in the unambitious way 2 people move when they are both paying attention to the same thing. Martin did not look at the room. He had no interest in the room's opinion tonight, and he was old enough to know that showing that you care what people think about, not caring what people think, is still caring what people think. But he noticed that Gerald Strom had repositioned himself again. He noticed that the association president had stopped to speak to the woman from the elementary division who had veered away from Laura earlier in the evening, and that their conversation was brief and quiet and slightly tense. He noticed that 3 people at table 14 were watching the dance floor with an expression he had seen on faces before, the face of someone recalibrating. He didn't say any of this to Laura. He thought, "Good." And then he thought about the student who'd sent river gauge readings on weekends. "The watershed unit," he said. "Did they present?" She came back from somewhere. "Your grade 10s. The watershed unit. Did they present the findings?" "They did a poster session in the library," she said, "in March. One group built a scale model of the Jock River drainage system out of foam board and modeling clay. It took 3 weeks. They were so proud of it." A pause. "It was genuinely good. Did you tell them that?" "Of course. Do you think they believed you?" "I think some of them did," she said. "The ones who'd built something they knew was real." He nodded. That was the true answer. That was always the true answer. The song ended and the playlist shifted to something slower. They stopped and there was the brief, honest moment that follows the end of any small thing when you're standing with a person you've only just met and neither of you has decided yet what the next thing is. "Thank you," Laura said. "For coming over. The river was worth discussing," he said. "Martin." He looked at her. "Thank you," she said again, and meant the whole evening this time. He nodded once, the way he nodded at the end of a good conversation in his classroom, acknowledging what had been said without turning it into more than what it was. They walked off the floor separately. Martin returned to table 12 and found that Gerald had finally exhausted the math curriculum and moved on to minor hockey scheduling. Laura walked back toward table 14, and this time one of the women who had angled her chair away turned and said something to her. Small, unremarkable, but her chair had moved back. Martin ate what was left of his dinner. At 9:45, the event wound toward its close. People retrieved coats, circled back for forgotten handbags, said things like we should do this more often to people they would not see again until next April. The association president gave a brief closing remarks about the strength of the educational community in the Ottawa-Carleton district. He did not mention Laura Ashby by name. He did not mention Martin. Martin found his coat at the check and was pulling it on in the lobby when he heard his name. Laura was standing near the glass doors that looked out onto the parking lot, her own coat already on, a scarf wound loosely at her collar. The river was no longer visible from here, just the parking lot and the street and the first few distant lights of the Manotick main strip. "You drove?" she asked. "Subaru by the east exit," he said. "The one that looks like it's been to more field trips than most students. That sounds specific. It's distinctive." She smiled. "I'm the gray Civic. Apparently we have the same automotive philosophy." They walked out into the April night. The air was cold and clean, the way Canadian spring nights are when the temperature drops back towards 6 or 7 after a day that had almost convinced everyone to put away their jackets. The parking lot lights cast that particular amber that makes everything look slightly like a memory while it's still happening. "That student," Laura said while they were still walking. "The one who plagiarized. Do you think she forgave you?" Martin considered it. "I think she understood eventually that forgiveness wasn't quite the right category," he said. "What happened was true. I reported what was true." "You don't forgive true." Laura nodded slowly. "The complaint I filed," she said. "I've spent the better part of 8 months wondering if I'd do it again." And she pulled her keys from her pocket. "Ask me in another 8 months. Fair," he said. They had reached the point where the east and west rows of the lot diverged. His Subaru was 20 meters to the right. Her Civic was presumably somewhere to the left. "There's a good coffee on Bridgeport near the school," she said, not quite looking at him. "Open Saturdays. They do a reasonable Americano. Nothing impressive, but the chairs are comfortable and they leave you alone." Martin looked at her. "What time on Saturday?" he said. 9. "If the watershed numbers need reviewing, I'll bring the data. I'll bring the documentary notes." She nodded once. The way people nod when something has been agreed to without needing to be oversold. She walked toward her car. He walked toward his. He sat in the Subaru for a moment before starting it. The way he sometimes sat in his classroom after the last student had left, in the specific quiet that follows a day when something real had occurred and he was still tracking what it was. A room had decided that Laura Ashby should stand at its edge. Laura had stood there anyway, and kept showing up, and kept teaching her grade 10s about watersheds, and kept fielding river gauge readings from students on weekends, because that was who she was underneath whatever the room had decided she was. He had simply crossed the floor. He started the car, pulled out of the lot, and drove north on Rideau Valley Drive with the river running cold and fast below him, carrying the last of the winter, not yet ready to settle but moving steadily in the direction it had always been moving.